right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 69 of the Swamp Creatures podcast. If anyone is listening in the chat, give us a nice, because we finally made it to 69. But, yeah, Rob couldn't make it for this episode, but I decided to keep on going without any of my fellow Swamp Creatures, because finally we're going to have the great Anarchism episode. And tonight we're joined by Kareem Maize. Did I pronounce that right?
Yes, you did.
All right, cool. Welcome to the show, Kareem.
Thank you.
So yeah, just to jump right into it then, because like we've kind of always beat around the bush on this show about anarchism, but we've never like done an episode or delved right into it. And you and I have gone back and forth, either online, sometimes in person at things like Young Americans for Liberty events. So, you know, I guess we might as well dive into it. Like, what exactly brought you to anarchism? And like, what is your interpretation of kind of the anarchist philosophy?
What brought me to anarchism? Interesting question. It was actually, I was really young and I was listening to pop punk music, things like Sum 41, Blink-182. And then one of my friends said, we're not listening to that anymore. And I was a little bit weird. And I wanted to be cool. That's all I wanted to do. Young dude, I wanted to fit in. And they said, Kareem, we're listening to Black Flag now. They're against the government. I said, that doesn't seem good. Like, why are you doing that? I said, oh, you know, you'll understand. Come to some shows with us. And I did. And they started to turn me on to bands. All these bands were fun, but they didn't have a concrete message, except for one. They gave me a British band called Crass. And they had a tagline that said, the only authority is yourself. Now, I didn't exactly knew what that meant, but as a teenager, I was kind of determined to figure it out. So I pulled it up and it basically said, like, this is your life. Take your own responsibility for it. The problem is with the punk movement, as much as I like it, I didn't have like a viable way to anarchism. SLC punk is cool to watch, but I don't actually want to live in perpetual chaos. It'd be hard to do this show if we were just like, yeah, chaos. Like, no, turn my internet and my electricity on. You know, sometimes the internet goes in and out. So then I found the great Dr. Ron Paul, and I really liked it. But the problem I had was, even talking to like some of my libertarian friends, I got to ask Gary Johnson questions. I just said to myself, if there was just a version of anarchism that was free market where I could keep free market aspects that I enjoy, like Bitcoin, like computers, and then experience anarchism that way, that'd be great. One day I heard Adam Kokesh say the only anarchists are anarcho-capitalists. I said, okay, I'm going to look into this. And I said, maybe I'm an ANCAP. But then a little bit later, as you know, running around like an ANCAP, I ran into other people in the liberty movement. People have different ideas. And eventually I ran into, you know, me and Danny, my co-host on my other show, Conquering the Divide, talked about it. Then we got some other guests on, Jeremy Harding and stuff like that. And I started to look at the roots of where anarcho-capitalism came from. Well, and this is my kind of argument. Anarchism started with Joseph Pierre Proudhon in France, which was a mutualist idea, which kind of combines a little bit of the right-wing spectrum of free markets, but also the left-wing spectrum of decentralized cooperation. And I kept looking into this, and I found Bakunin and Kropotkin and Emma Goldman. I said, well, and Malatesta, there's a history leading up to where Rothbard and Mises came up with their ideas. There's a history we shouldn't forget, because it's not like Rothbard came up with the idea of anarchy. There were left-wing anarchists. Mises laid the foundation for libertarianism, and to me, Rothbard took the synergy of the two, which is good.
Yeah.
But then I started even looking into other things which people thought were taboo, because I said, look, if you get rid of the White House and the WEF and the state government tomorrow, there'll be some normies who just hang out. But then there will be pockets of people with different ideas. What if I don't want to be a free market capitalist and all the system? What else is there? So there's decentralized communes, or we call it anarcho-communism. There's ways of organizing in specific working groups to help mitigate externalities and overreaching authority, the Monty Python skit, or this is an anarcho-syndicalist commune. And I even look into other things, John Zerzan's work on anarcho-primitivism, mutualism, and also agorism as well. And I decided that even if you had the perfect scenario in the world that you wanted, with all the authoritarians being toppled tomorrow, there'd be different ideas of anarchism. I'm not saying you should adopt it. I am saying, especially to people, when I talk to Jack Lloyd and stuff, I am saying, fine, you don't want to be a primitivist. You like technology. I'm using technology. You don't want to be in a commune. That's fine. But can we talk to other anarchists who do, so we can socially cooperate? And that's the foundation. So that's how I got into it. And that's why I say what I say and do what I do.
I mean, right on, man. It sounds like you've been on quite the philosophical journey throughout the years. And I got to say, you're the first person I can honestly say you're the first person I've ever talked to who's kind of come into this starting from sort of that anarcho-punk perspective. Black Flag, by the way, remind me, that's Henry Rollins' group, right?
Correct. Yeah, I came in through an anarcho-punk perspective because we were mad at, like, okay, well, George Bush is doing this and the police are out of control and we don't really have a coherent way to vocalize it. And we're like kids at the time. So there was zero chance I was going to pick up Rothbard. But when someone says, like, oi, oi, and you turn on some Exploited and you just hear I Believe in Anarchy, which I still play those songs. I still play Crass. Oh, yeah. I love that. I think Crass still has a deeply philosophical message as well, if you look at what they were saying. The problem I had with the punk movement, even though I came in through that, is they don't really have a substantial way to... I don't like the word coordinate society because that sounds like central planning. But they don't have a substantial way to really interact with society or solve things like social cooperation under the division of labor. Because if you just have chaos or if you just have partying all the time, nothing gets produced and you can't really quote. So they're good for hyping you up and getting you against the state. But then
it's very reactionary in a way.
Yeah.
You're reacting to the chaos of the world.
Yes. Which I still think there's a place for that. I still love that protest song by Anti-Flag where they just take out the guitar. Protest in state terror. I can get down with that. I can get down with that. I can play that on guitar. I think that's great when we do it. I think it was great at Rage Against the War Machine when you get people from all different spectrums of the left and the right to work together. And I honestly think if you can get more people to socially cooperate, that leads you more and more to a libertarian society. Because if people with different ideas and different cultural backgrounds can work together, and communities of different backgrounds, you get a community that believes in common law or constitutional law or something else to work together, you don't need the state. And effectively, that's how societies where government collapsed were able to facilitate.
I gotcha. So going into just the thing that kind of sparked me wanting to have you come on, is this idea of anarchist unity and all that. Because
correct,
a long time ago, man, I got really involved in that sort of stuff, and maybe I've just become more black-pilled over the years. I feel like I've done the opposite, where I kind of came in through anarcho-capitalism and kind of went full circle and have found myself back at Rothbard again. As weird as that might sound. But at the same time, I'm not really closed off to a lot of these different left-wing ideals either. I see their utility, especially when you look at places like Christiania, Denmark, where it's kind of ironically Hoppian in the sense that if you want to move into Christiania, they want to, make sure that you're a fellow ANCOM who's going to fit in with the social order of the town and everything like that. In some ways, I see that as kind of a perfect model, as long as, I'm sure you would agree, as long as no one is kind of infringing on the other one's rights.
Correct. Yeah. I've even made the recent comment, I don't think Karl Marx was a communist. People are like, what? He wrote the Communist Manifesto. Fine. He wrote it. That's fine. I can write down that I am a Bitcoin billionaire, which would be great. But unless you achieve a successful decentralized commune, I don't really think and to even go further back, like you're talking about, you said Bakun had some good ideas. Emma Goldman also made the statement, hey, there's no communism in Russia. I'm like, what does she mean by that? That doesn't make any sense. Maybe she's just, I'm like, no, I know, I get what she means now. There's no decentralized communes. You've effectively replaced the royal family with a czar, or with another person who's even worse, who's just an authoritarian. And people get in the names as the state capitalist, as the authoritarian this. It doesn't really matter. I guess my point, to break it down, is, when I went full circle, I saw there was other ideas, and the Zapatistas are a good example of that. They're in Mexico. They still work. That's actually Rage Against the Machine, another band I was listening to, that they've worked with them. There's things like Chiron, which you can argue border on some left-wing and right-wing ideas. And honestly, I think the best way, or one of the best ways, to fight against the state is to do what the Mises Caucus does, which is getting people in local office. But not everybody wants to run for local office. There are people I know in the Mad Liberty Discord who say, I want to start my own commune. Well, what if we help fund little communes everywhere? There's no way authoritarians can control you if there's, if one town's 500 little communes or something like that. So just to me, an effective way of doing decentralization. The only fundamental difference is how you utilize property. As ANCAPs, we'd probably say, I want a society of completely private property. Left-wing ideas would say, if to me they're genuine, depending on where you're coming from, well, we're going to use mutual aid, maybe, like so-and-so needs this. So, and if you live in a completely income society, they might make the distinction between private or personal property and private property, which the idea, I think Kropotkin said, is, hey, if you have a surplus of this, like say I have 15 laptops sitting around, say I can only utilize one at one time. So I'm going to give those 14 laptops to the community so they can come up with something, create Discord servers, write code, whatever it is. And by doing the distinguishing between personal and private property, you effectively make a strong community because people can utilize the common goods. That's my understanding of it. Now, I'm not an expert, but I think there's interesting ideas here. Also, mutual aid is an interesting idea, and even agorism, something to look into.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. Yeah, as far as mutual aid and agorism go, those are both the nuggets the golden nuggets among the dirt that I found when I kind of looked into old ideas. Because when I look into old ideas, I'm keeping in mind that this is coming from someone's perspective, from an earlier era, from that we live in now. Like when you look at Karl Marx's writing, even back when it was written, you can kind of understand the perspective he is coming from, given the world. And that's why Das Kapital is very different from the Communist Manifesto, from what I understand, because it was written at a different point in his life. But as far as like the personal property and private property thing, I think that's where a lot of the disagreement comes into place, because it kind of creates that line of where people wonder, like, where is the line drawn here? Like if your example of like all the laptops, if someone had all those and said like, yeah, I have no use for this, but I would love to give it to the community for it to do that. That's, that's purely voluntary.
Mm-hmm.
But then you kind of enter that territory of, well, what if they just say, what if I have a use for this somewhere down the line? You know what I mean? So my thing, and I'm sure a lot of people would agree with this, but it comes down to whether it's voluntary or not for me.
Correct. That's the fundamental thing that connects everything is voluntary interaction, and we're not going to use force. Then once that has been established as a fundamental basis and a building block, then you can have distinctions on, okay, well, how do we want to utilize property in this society? Because even in different ANCAP societies, utilizing property would be different. And what's funny is I used to go into like ANCOM servers and like, hey guys, I want to collaborate with you. It's not working out with the conservatives or the Democrats that well. And they're like, you're a neo-feudalist. You're a neo-feudalist. I'm like,
I've heard that.
and I said, I'm not going to call myself an ANCAP. I'm a free market anarchist. They're like, hey, I'm like, wow. It's like parkour into, a different thing, different reality. I'm like, I'm a free market anarchist. They're like, oh, okay, yeah. You like free markets and anarchy. Yes. So I made that small distinction. And some people have said, they look at, especially my friends who are more on the left would say ANCAPs are more oriented to free market anarchy, not so much the capitalism or corporatism we see today, and how most things would be solved as mutual aid, like GoFundMe's or, hey, I need, like, one thing I do with Mad Liberty and my friends in Mad Liberty is if someone needs help, I'll say, hey, voluntarists, comrades, everyone, here's a $, Cash App, help so-and-so out. They need whatever it is they need. And to me, that society would be handled and would be better and it would be more effective if A, the dollar wasn't being devalued by the Fed, and B, if the money was sound. I think you could have it even more, and mutual aid's very effective in my opinion, based on what we can see now with just simple fundraising and simple giving. Imagine how much more effective it would be without the state.
Oh, without a doubt. And as far as the term capitalism goes, I've had this theory for a while now, but I've never really talked with anyone about it. So now seems like a good time since it's kind of come up here. I can't help but wonder if something like what we would call anarcho-capitalism is very influenced by American history, because in many ways anarcho-communism is born out of European history. And capitalism in America is, it has a much more positive connotation as compared to other places.
Yeah,
so I've always wondered if that's maybe why there's this difference in opinion on that.
It's possible. I think the issue is sometimes when we say certain words that people will come up with certain ideas. It's interesting because when I'm talking to different groups, it's going to sound fun. I almost will identify different things. Like when I'm talking to Maize people, yeah, I'm an ANCAP. It's cool. But when I talk to people on the left wing, they're like anarcho-capitalism, and they associate capitalism with the corporatism now. So sometimes I have to say I'm free market anarchist. So they're like, oh, okay, Rothbard and stuff. Conservatives don't mind. Well, they're not capitalists, but conservatives will say they're pro-capitalist. That's a whole nother thing to unpack. But they don't like the anarchy part because they think, oh, it's just people beat. So I'll say, oh, I'm a libertarian. So but then I'll go into, well, I don't really think the state has any useful function, and kind of preface it that way. And when I'm talking to people who are super, super left wing, I'll still say, hey, I'm an ANCAP or whatever it is, because they aren't really going to get common ground with me at all. That's kind of how it breaks down. I think people have negative and positive connotations about economic systems, but it really just comes down to, if you take away what you perceive to be capitalism, what you perceive to be collectivism, what you perceive to be these specific systems, and see how people interact, that's what's more important, rather than getting mad at a specific word. And that's interesting because a lot of people don't know. Karl Marx was so convinced at the end of his writings that communism, his version of communism, would be capitalism. He said it was almost pretty much an undeniable fact. So he fought with other leftists, specifically Bakunin. And Bakunin just made the observation, if you give the working class power, they'll be just as bad or worse than the czar. And the transition period doesn't make sense because who really gives up power? So while people give, and this is one point I want to make, while people give Solzhenitsyn credit, that's fair. Give Bakunin the same credit, because he said even before to Marx, look, it ain't going to work. Don't let the proletariat just take power.
Yeah, I forget what the exact quote was, but it was in the documentary Anarchism in America, where Bakunin basically had this haunting warning saying that the the communist dictatorship of the proletariat would be one of the most bloodthirsty regimes the world would ever see. And what you're saying with labels too, it's funny. We had Buck Johnson on some weeks ago, and we didn't really talk about anarchism. We talked more about Orthodox Christianity in that episode, and he had a really good point, which is essentially what you're saying here too, where it's like when you bring up certain terms around certain people, they automatically they automatically think of that person in their head that they think that is associated with that ideology that they've had arguments in their head with all the time. So it's like, oh, now this person exists, even though you're not that person, obviously. But yeah, that it's that sort of hard headedness that I have that almost got me disenchanted more so with a lot of that with that world.
Yeah, because once you start sticking labels on everything, then you're like, oh, well, and you can pick up the typical things. Oh, a NCAP is just, some businessman with a bunch of private security, but that's not who I am. I'm not saying I'm against private security, but not me. Oh, an agorist is just, whatever it is, somebody selling something out of like a car or whatever, like black market. Oh, a ANCOM is just someone with a hood over their head and just punching people and being recklessly violent, doesn't have any philosophical backing behind it. And that's the issue, is sometimes people can just point to this and say, oh, this whole demographic thinks like this because they look like this or they have this particular label. That's not really true at all. And there's things out there, there's anomalies to me that are even weird. There's people who, there are Marxist MAGA people, and I've seen that. At first, I'm like, that isn't real, and then, hey, it exists. So there's some very interesting stuff out there. So
it's funny you bring that up because there's immediately a human being that pops into my head that fits the exact description of Marxist MAGA person that you're talking about there.
I watch Jackson Henkel sometimes just to see what he has to say. I don't agree with him because I'm anti-Marxist. I'm pro-Bakunin. I'm even the guy who goes back and says, look, we can correct history by correcting some things that went wrong. We need to get more decentralized communes and push out these Marxists, because these Marxists are not good. Bakunin was right. As far as I'm concerned,
real quickly, just to set the stage here, are you talking about, like, say, if you had a time machine and went back in time, what you would change to kind of write the course of history? Is that what you're saying here?
Correct. If I had a time machine, well, other than, the stupid things I've done, but if I had a time machine, I'd go back and stop Carrot Top. I watch Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Then I go back and be like, look, Bakunin, you need to get rid of Marx, and you need to tell these people we're just going straight from the royal family. I'm not defending the royal Russian family. That we need to go straight from that if we're going to do this to decentralized communes, and the kulaks can have their own commune and these can have their own commune, and we'll figure out the property rights based on that. And then Kropotkin could come along and then improve upon it, and Malatesta and Rudolf Rocker did an excellent job with syndicalism. I'll go as far as to say if people listened to Bakunin, the Holodomor would have not happened. I can't prove that, but in another dimension where Dimebag Darrell didn't get shot and they listened to Bakunin, things are better.
No, I get what you're saying, and it makes you wonder, because I've had a similar theory before. Like, if you had a time machine and you wanted to go back and try and save things, mine is quite different. In my instance, I always said you go back, you basically convince the Tsar to listen to Rasputin about the war and just execute Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. But I see how that also leaves kind of this, I don't know if vacuum is the right word, but you leave this vacuum of power where there were other forces that would look for it at that time too. And I can see why you'd immediately want to point to Bakunin and say, yeah, maybe you should go to this guy instead. But then we did see what kind of unraveled in Ukraine under the Free Ukraine, anarchist Ukraine. And it wasn't exactly, it was pretty brutal. I don't know if you can really call it anarchist in many instances.
No, you can't, because what Stalin did was confiscate all their stuff, and the fundamental purpose that all these that Kropotkin is we should have voluntary stuff. So we're not taking the kulak's stuff. We're not taking anybody's stuff. Now you can say like, oh, okay, if you have too much wheat or if you have extra tools, do you want to put this in a shed? I'm being very, very just theoretical here, but let's say, oh, I have extra plows. Okay, everybody puts this in a shed, and then, if you need to use a plow, you can use it for free or collectively or pay 2 rubles or whatever it is. That would be kind of how I would see it. Now, again, I'm not an expert on social cooperation under division of labor in an ANCOM society. My friend Lizard Jesus is pretty good with that stuff. He's read more on that, but that's how I'd see social cooperation working there. Now, it works differently in ANCAP societies, but yeah, I do think, I don't know if it would have turned out perfectly. There's no perfect society, but I do think if people listen to, fine, you have the Tsar execute Lenin and Stalin. I'm all for that, but can we try actual decentralized communes?
And that's where I would totally agree with. My biggest concern comes into place with characters like Nestor Manco. Like, are you familiar with him?
I can't say I am, no.
He was so there was an anarchist kind of thing in Ukraine after the Tsar was taken down, and you had this 3-way civil war between the Black Army, the Red Army, and the White Army. White Army obviously being that wanting to bring back the Tsar, the Black Army being the anarchist army, and the Red Army, well, pretty self-explanatory.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the things I read under the Black Army, it didn't really seem anarchist at all. Like, we can debate all day and night about the Spanish Civil War, but there still are very anarchist elements within the Spanish Civil War. I'm reading stuff about Ukraine, and it's like, people executed for alcohol. I'm just like, what is going on over here? Other than you're using the banner of anarchism to basically push anarcho-tyranny.
Correct. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of people who do that. I would even argue, and I know this is reaching, but when ANCAPs even push for something like, oh, well, let's just have this particular minarchy here, and then we'll get here, and then they want to enforce stuff through the minarchy, that's bad too. So yes, there are people, to me, once you start using force against other people, you're not an anarchist. And Antifa, there's a lot of members who are guilty of that, because they'll put my biggest problem with Antifa is not, I hate when they say, just an idea. The idea, I don't actually have a problem with the black and red flag. My problem is when you start using violence and you start hunting that flag. I'm like, no, that's not destroying property. It's a different distinction of property. You're not confiscating someone's stuff. You're coming up with a collective way of distribution that's different than maybe Rothbard would propose. And does that have some advantages? I think it does in a very small scale society, or even maybe a large to medium scale society. It doesn't seem, though, that Kropotkin's ideas or Malatesta's ideas, as much as I like them, work in wide scale things. It seems the only anarchist philosophies that seem to work in wide scale things are agorism, anarcho-capitalism, and maybe some different variants of, I guess, what you would call, I'm trying to find the word here, different like individualist anarchist ideas. So like anarcho-pacifism or individualism or things like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of different variations of the individualist schools there, but you brought up Antifa, so I just want to know what you kind of think of them, because my perspective on Antifa, at least, especially the last several years, is that American Antifa is very different than European Antifa. And what I see here in America almost reminds me of, have you ever played the video game Skyrim at all?
Yes.
Okay, are you familiar with that cloak that you can get in the game, where you put on this cloak, you can basically go commit crimes, and it's never affiliated with...
Yes.
Part of me wonders if what we see with Antifa here in the United States is kind of... It's a similar phenomenon, where you have leftists who use the cloak of anarchism to raise hell when necessary.
Yeah, I think there's an issue here. And here, my fundamental issue is that they're being used they might have some ideas like we're talking about, but then they get used by elites to fight against the right-wing authoritarian faction, which to me, I've talked with my real ANCOM friends about that. If you're a dedicated anarchist on the left or the right or in the center, which I kind of, then you don't advocate unless there's very circumstant, like I'll say like Vivek said this is good, or I like what RFK said here, but you don't really try and hardcore advocate for, well, we need more government or we need to help, support this or that. My opinion on Antifa is I would prefer they stop smashing, a lot of them stop smashing Starbucks windows. I know the coffee is expensive, but stop utilizing violence and go home if you really believe in what you believe in, and look up Anarchism in the State, look up Anarchism by Malatesta, look at Emma Goldman's work, familiarize yourself with that, and then say, okay, this is good. Put theory into practice while the Mises Caucus is tearing it up and getting people in local positions. The way you can strengthen that is say, hey, I have friends of this persuasion or that persuasion, or everybody who is of a certain idea, maybe everybody who's a fan of Mitch Connor from South Park, we're all going to start a commune. Can you help me start a commune? If you have enough communes, you can't be controlled by anything. And that's kind of been my theory. It's like, why do you push so hard for anarchism? Because I've seen the destruction of the state, and I feel that extreme decentralization would have its problems, but it would lead to a better society.
So on that note too, what's your take on the Chaz? Because at first I was a little bit hopeful. Like part of me was thinking like maybe this will end up being the American version of Christiania. But then when I saw their attempt at a community garden, I realized this isn't going to end well.
Yeah, my take is fun. In theory, maybe it was a nice idea. Let's have autonomous zones. But before we do that, again, this is why I think ANCAPs or, working with ANCOMs are useful, because you can get people who are grounded in theory and stuff like, okay, before you go like Viva la Revolution, that has its place, and making Molotovs and fighting, and that's all cool. Let's talk about social cooperation under the division of labor. How do you make the plants? How do you distribute them? How do you distribute this? How do you make this and then distribute this? How do you get all the parts for the cell phone? How do you do this in a decentralized fashion that's better than the state? What is the public choice option, as Dr. Leeson would say? And how can we use decentralization to do what the public choice does, which isn't very hard, and do it better? So I'm just looking at, okay, the state's doing this. How can I do it better? And some things are I think are easier than done, like policing. There's a lot of people who say like, hey, we can, or private police, or maybe there'll be community policing or something like that. That's fine. I'm all for that. And then let's expand it and take it a bit further and see how we can work with other communities. So that's my issue, is maybe autonomous zones like Chaz are a good idea in theory, but if you don't really have a tangible, how am I going to do stuff, that falls apart. It's kind of like the reason I left punk, and the reason I don't like some anarchist stuff is because I get the state's evil and the most culprit when it comes to killing people and stealing money. But if you're going to beat them on a level where people can live and will want to exist in your society, you have to create a level of wealth that's equal to or greater than what they produce. Then you can make the fundamental argument for anarchism, like in Chiron. Hey, look, this is safer than all of Mexico. Maybe we're poor, but it's safe, and we're getting things to work. I think you can even make the argument like, look, in New Hampshire, we already have some left-right unity in the Free State Project. Not everybody in New Hampshire, I would wager to say, is identifying as an ANCAP or right-wing anarchist. I'm sure there are some, but I'm sure there's a lot of agorists and probably some maybe left-wing anarchists or something like that. I haven't been up there yet, but I'll make it up there. So
Got to make the pilgrimage up to New Hampshire at some point.
Gotta get to Pork Fest.
Of course. I will say, when I went to New Hampshire, there were a lot of points where it did feel like an anarcho-capitalist stronghold of sorts.
Okay.
At least with Portsmouth. I haven't been to any other parts, but there were several things that kind of made me think, wow, this really... It's the only state I've ever been to where I got $1 back in my change from 7-Eleven, and the dollar had a stamp on it that said not to be used for bribing politicians. I still got that dollar in the vault, so
Excellent.
Would have been perfect for here.
I see Michael Malice's book behind you. So yeah, Michael Malice, one thing I like is that he doesn't, and he was one that got me into a lot. Michael Malice doesn't just say, oh, okay, it's Rothbard. I know people just like Rothbard and Hans Hermann Hoppe. I'm like,
yeah,
great. That's 2 books. But that is also to me like saying, okay, well, I'm just going to read one book about religion and then everything else is wrong. I'd say if you want to understand the great mystery, like Palpatine says, you can't just stick with the view of the Jedi. So for me, I think whether or not people, I think it's interesting to look at these different societies. It's interesting to compare and contrast. And even something like anarcho-primitivism, which is even more fringe on the left side, is interesting to look at, because I think with certain distinctions, and even looking at the presentations on it, you can make some good arguments as to why society would be better in certain aspects of it and how that can interact with other societies as well.
Yeah, and as far as anarcho-primitivism goes, it's funny because that was one that I used to laugh the most at. But now in this technological age where it feels like we are almost on a suicide mission going towards a weird combination of Blade Runner, Brave New World, and 1984, I honestly can't help but look at some of the criticisms of technology and just look at certain things like dating apps and social media and all that and think, okay, I don't know if the solution is what they say, because there are a lot of good things that have come out of technology too, like on the medical end and stuff like that. But there's definitely a conversation to be had here.
That's all I'm saying. That is all I'm saying. Like if Jack Lloyd was here, I would say, look, listen, I'm not saying Teddy K saying the Industrial Revolution should never have happened is correct. John Zerzan goes even further. I've had him on my podcast and said agriculture was a step too far. And yes, you can argue that agriculture, you could feed more people, but the food is of lower quality. And the food's of such low quality now that I'm like, I have a bunch of supplements to the right of me just to make things work. There's definitely an argument with certain things in the world, like microplastics wreaking havoc on everything. There's an issue now I see where like older people want to work, don't have money, apply online, and it causes a huge barrier. And anarcho-primitivists would say something like a car is great. Like, ooh, I can get here, it's convenient. But now everyone has one. What if you want? And then I posted one day, being an ANCAP myself, I posted a little picture of a highway, and there were a bunch of cars here. And it said, why doesn't anyone walk anywhere anymore? And walking would help, in my opinion, with the obesity problems. But why doesn't anyone walk anymore? Well, because you really, in a lot of instances, can't. Now, I'm not saying we do away with technology, but I am saying, look, just like it goes back to my argument, if you get rid of Washington, D.C., the WF, state governments, or if they are greatly reduced, there'd be a certain group of people who say, I don't like capitalism. Okay. Do you want a commune? No. Are you an agorist? No. I don't. Civilization just doesn't work for me. There's federal lands over there, and we have knowledge. The Hadza do get really good nutrition. The Sand Bushmen do get good nutrition. And there's certain aspects to really look at and say, like, how much of this technology is good. AI is causing problems with deep fakes and things like that, even information that doesn't look real. EMFs to me aren't the greatest things. And I understand people say, well, you have a crypto channel, you're a Fiverr guy, you're doing all this stuff. Yes. But I also have a lot of admiration for people or anarchists who can live in a cabin or live in a tribe, or whether that's a band tribe or a different type of tribe, and come up with ways to just utilize the land. That is a skill, in my opinion, that's necessary when the power goes out. So let's not discount this completely just because Teddy K said some crazy things or Zerzan said some things that you think are outside. And I know people are going to think I'm nuts. Like, what? Why even look into anarcho-primitivism? I think it's a fascinating thing to look at.
I agree, and honestly, just because this is kind of the other side of the debate here too, and we're kind of dipping into it, like the sort of anarchist transhumanist perspective. That is something too that I transhumanism has become something that a lot of people fear, and I can kind of see why. And I can also see why people coming from this sort of more transhumanist perspective on anarchism, they see this as a way to try and, instead of using this technology to enslave us, maybe we can steer the ship in a direction to where this technology frees us. And I saw that especially when reading the old papers from the cypherpunks and the crypto anarchist was it the crypto anarchist manifesto or was it the cypherpunk manifesto? I'm probably getting this horribly wrong right now.
I think you're
But
fine.
Timothy Maize thing, kind of diving into that, and there's a lot of potential that I see, but I always wonder, how can the good overcome that which is bad in all of this?
So I'll make one distinction. Nobody has done this, so I think it'll be the first time. When you look at anarchism, it's a negation saying, I don't want any rulers. But there's certain philosophies that are customized to individual lifestyles and perspectives, and there are some that are economic systems, like mutualism, anarcho-capitalism. You could argue agorism maybe, but mostly anarcho-communism and syndicalism. Those four are economic systems. Then there'd be specific lifestyle things, like you say, fine, I'm a pacifist, like Leo Tolstoy. On the other side of anarcho-primitivism, which that's a lifestyle thing, and it's kind of an economic system because you are creating a pre-industrial or pre-agricultural economy. But things like anarcho-individualism or transhumanism, I can't say I've met any transhumanists, but I have a friend who did. Now, at the end of the day, I think transhumanism is something to fear because people like the World Economic Forum, Bill Gates, all those people are utilizing it to enslave you, like, oh, and they're going to do it through the guise of convenience, like, oh, just use your palm here, get a chip here. Now, if you got the authoritarians out of the way and someone said, hey, I want to do stuff like, customize this machine and be all Warhammer like, and I want to prolong my life with machines and this and stuff like that. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that if it's completely voluntary and there's no state and there's no central apparatus behind it, then go ahead and I guess, experiment with some cyborg stuff if that's really what you want to do. And there are people who want to do that. I'm sure a very select few that do. There's a nice little, just like mutualism, in my opinion, can connect anarcho-capitalists and ANCOMs and syndicalists through mutual aid by voluntary giving. There's another philosophy called solar punk, if you've ever seen it, that kind of puts together like, let's have some buildings that are eco-friendly and stuff. And maybe we could come to a understanding between anarcho-primitivism and the other extreme, which is transhumanism. There's definitely more primitivists, in my opinion, than transhumanists, but they're very small in number.
I feel like it flipped over the years. Like when I was first getting into anarchism, I met a lot of people online who were into transhumanism. I actually got added to some groups, and
Sweet.
it was getting kind of freaky, and I had to leave because it was getting just bizarre to where it's like, man, this is, to kind of say what I said earlier again. It felt like, kind of like we're going into Blade Runner here with some of the weird stuff. But then when I got in, are you familiar with the cypherpunks at all?
I'm familiar with cyberpunk for the game.
Cyberpunk is different than cypherpunk. Cipher as in like a cipher, your cipher from cryptography.
Maybe. No, I don't think so. Actually, I'll say no.
Okay, I highly recommend looking into these guys because in a way, with what I learned from them, it was almost like these guys were people in the 90s who were practically pioneers of the internet. They were a bunch of crypto nerds who were creating technologies, or at least were creating technologies that would eventually go on to become things that we use today, like Bitcoin and stuff like that. It's
Mhm.
strongly believed that Satoshi was one of the people on the cypherpunk newsletters. Julian Assange was one of the subscribers to the cypherpunk
Nice.
newsletters. Um, but with them, there was this big emphasis on things like privacy. Like that was the big thing with them, was privacy is like an inalienable right. And with some of the stuff that I see with, the World Economic Forum, people pushing transhumanism, it seems as though they want to completely eradicate the private element there. And part of me feels like the privacy is kind of what makes it more of a liberty thing as compared to a tyrannical thing.
Correct. And that's the issue. The issue is, as far as I'm concerned, the WF just wants control on a global level. But you can't just Genghis Khan stuff because everybody has a cell phone here. So they have to say, whoa, we don't want to take over. We want to help you guys out. It's convenient. Look at this technology. Isn't it so cool? If you look at their little get-togethers at Davos, they're not like, ha ha ha, we'll enslave you all. They're like, we have a great new technology to help connect the world. Isn't it great? Here's a logo and a nice intro. We can connect the world. What they're not saying is, oh, behind all my nice semantic language, we can enslave you by keeping all this technology highly centralized and in control of a few central planners who are psychopaths. They're not going to say that. Now, the cypherpunk thing I think is cool. I think it's even cool to look at certain things in biohacking, which I'm a fan of biohacking. That doesn't exactly translate. But hey, if there are certain things that people want to individually pursue, I think
What
they should.
exactly is biohacking? I don't really have an idea there.
So biohacking is kind of the idea that's popularized by people like Ben Greenfield and Dave Asprey that we can use natural things like NMN, taurine, things like that, supplements, and also technology. Like I use red light technology and things like that, or even something as simple as earthing. There's certain technological and natural aspects that can help improve human performance and potentially prolong human life. So I'm for that. I'm all for that. I mean, I'm all for things like I got LASIK on my eyes. I think that was great. So I think there's good aspects to highly technological societies as well. And it's finding the balance between those two. And I don't actually completely disagree with one side or another. I say, like, let's look at both of them. Let's see what the Sam Bushmen are getting right. Let's see what the people in the Kalahari Desert are getting right through their diet, through this, through interacting. But let's see also what they're getting wrong and see what the narco transhumanists are getting right. And people get really, really annoyed when I say that. And I'll even say there's like researchers like Mark Passio. I love his work. But then he'll say, like, this is all bad. It's just anarchism. You're either anarchist or not. I say there's fundamental distinctions in how people live their lifestyle and how they interact with the economy or don't. So, and my biggest thing, if I were to say the great anarchism thing, is anarchists need to stop saying, provided someone's not aggressing against you, stealing your property, or causing you ill will through transgression or duress, people need to stop saying we're the only anarchists. We're the ANCOMs are the only anarchists. ANCAPs are the only anarchists. I mean, granted, Adam Kokesh said that, and I looked it up, but I don't agree with that anymore. We need to stop. Mutualists are the only anarchists. Agorists are the only anarcho-transhumanists are the only anarchists, or primitivists are the only anarchists. Or you can't be an anarchist and also be trans, because that's not true. So that's my main thing, and I get a lot of flack for that, because certain people are like, well, I agree with these people being anarchists, but these people can't be anarchists. And you can come with a plethora of different reasons why you don't think they are. But to me, as long as you're voluntarily interacting, you're pushing for decentralization, you're respecting the NAP, then you are fundamentally an anarchist or not, like Mel Testa would say.
Yeah, no, I completely agree there. So we're kind of getting up at the top of the hour here. So we did bring up agorism a few times here. So, right at the end here, I kind of want to go into this because, one of the things that got me into the anarchist world is I made a page called Agorist Ball back in the day,
Nice.
which Anarchy Ball's gone. Agorist Ball's the last remaining one. We are the real anarchists. I just wanted to share that. But I'm just kidding. But I'd be curious to hear what's your opinion on the letters between Murray Rothbard and Samuel Edward Konkin.
So my thing is actually, I think Konkin got the free market aspect and the black market and the gray market and those distinctions right to a point where Konkin's work actually helped me come up with certain terms like red market equilibrium, saying, hey, look, state's not good, but if you have competing states sometimes. So my opinion is this: Konkin was correct in his approach to we need a specific way to fight against the state through the free market. Where I think he was wrong is the system still exists, and political systems might exist at a local level even. So it doesn't help to just say, hey, I'm just going to ignore this, or I'm just off there, because authoritarians don't see it like that. Authoritarians are going to go, oh, you're an agorist. My bad. You don't have to pay taxes. You cool. That's my opinion. They were right and wrong in both aspects. Murray Rothbard's approach is good because, hey, we need to get engaged. We can fight back. We can use this. We can use the tool of the state to fight against that, even though it's an imperfect method. But you do want free market forces, and you want free market things to help push culture forward towards freedom, like Eric July stuff, like Jack Lloyd's comic books, like what you guys are doing with Swamp Things. You do want that as well. Black and gray markets, to me, are highly, highly effective. What's interesting is if you get rid of the state, there really is no black or gray market anymore. And all this actually becomes almost one thing. If you get rid of the state, to me, agorists and anarcho-capitalists would be very similar, if not almost the same.
I mean, they definitely are very similar in their ideas. Agorism does generally have more of a left libertarian streak, though, I would say, just based on its roots and, where Konkin's perspective is coming from. I also kind of understand where Murray Rothbard was coming from when he basically, and, this isn't really even a knock on Konkin, it's just an observation. A lot of times when people are writing their philosophies, it's their worldview. Mm-hmm. And Konkin was a very art-minded guy. And, I think a lot of what he wrote about was basically the artist's revolution. Like, I don't know if you remember towards the end of the New Libertarian Manifesto, he kind of outlines what his ideal stages of the libertarian revolution would be. And that's the thing that I just don't think it holds up as much. I mean, the black and gray markets are definitely really important. Like, we saw what they did with the Soviet Union. We see what they're doing with North Korea now. But I just don't think it's the only thing. I don't feel like it's enough.
Yes, I actually feel it's not enough. I feel it's a good addition. And even in developed countries, in America, we have black market and gray market activity that is not a small part of GDP. The thing is, black market and gray market activity does not seem to have the capacity in terms of decentralizing huge structures. You need actually ANCAP tactics and tactics from something like the Mises Caucus to do that. Why I like anarcho-capitalism is it appeals to a huge swath of people because they can say, look, I can live almost the same lifestyle I'm living now, but we're going to apply principles of free market anarchism to get rid of the state. And I think, honestly, that's where most people would fall. Now, granted, they're still be agorists and they do things maybe a little bit differently. There's still a little bit of a left-wing thing with agorists and mutualists and Georgists and things like that. I think that's interesting to look into. ultimately think Rothbard was more correct in, hey, we have to utilize what we have now. But Konkin does some good work in, hey, there's black and gray markets, and let's not forget about that, because through that you can get things, that philosophy makes things like 3D printers very effective.
Oh, yeah.
So,
well, right on, man. Well, we are getting up to the top of the hour here, so I'm going to bring this plane in for landing here if our outro music wants to turn on here. Gotta love Restream. There it is. So, Kareem, is there anything you want to plug here? I know you brought up a podcast at the beginning here.
Correct. I have a podcast, The Essential Libertarians, on YouTube, and my co-host has one as well. I have two co-hosts. We have Conquering the Divide, and also definitely check out my boy. We haven't done one in a while, but Leighton Radner. We still plan on going. Outlawed Thoughts.
Hell yeah.
And the last thing, and check out the Mises Caucus as well to keep the ideals of Murray Rothbard and Ron Paul alive. I'll just end it with a quote from Errico Malatesta: by the anarchist spirit, I mean that deeply human sentiment which aims at the good of all, freedom and justice of all, solidarity and love among the people, which is not an exclusive characteristic only of self-declared anarchists, but inspires all people who have a generous heart and an open mind.
Hell yeah, man. And as for me, go follow me on Twitter at MitchConnorJLo as always. Also, go check out 1776swag.com. If we do have any anarchist listeners listening to this, that synthwave sun that I put in the thumbnail, I actually threw on some merch. So go check that out, everyone. It's not just statist propaganda I upload on there. Got to pay the bills somehow. But anyway, tune in next week. We have I don't want to give away our guest, but it's going to be a rock and roll episode. It's kind of perfect that we were talking about anarcho-punk in this episode too, because he's kind of a punk himself. Maybe a little bit emo. But we will see you all